Right from the word go in Age of Wonders 4, there are a lot of difficult decisions that you have to make around faction customization that will set you up for the rest of the game. In this video, which is as much a tier list as it is a guide and walkthrough for the 6 cultures in Age of Wonders 4, I'm going to lay it all out bare for you. I'll be inspecting their affinity potential, their unique trait and units that they all offer, their unique structures and yield, and any extra bonuses they have. Let's like the video and get started. Starting at the top, we have the feudal culture, one of 2 cultures that provides some nature affinity alongside one order. It's also one of only 2 cultures that doesn't just focus down a specific affinity tree. When we look into it a little bit closer, we figure out that feudal societies are about structures with food income, and we'll have a look at the actual detail behind those in a second. Units benefit from standing together, which gives them increased strength if they're adjacent, and you have feudal lords. This is the unique trait for the feudal culture. It allows our governors to have extra powerful abilities, like additional food, additional knowledge, additional magic into cities. One hero can be one of these governors, 5 in total, and we can place them in and get a little bit of extra yield onto our cities generally. It's nice to have. Jumping over to the Age of Wonders 4 database that I'll have linked below, just like I do with all of my sources. It's a fantastic resource for looking at Age of Wonders 4 data, go figure. We can have a look at their specific units. The feudal culture comes with, like most, a series of units in tiers 1, 2, and 3. In this case, of course, we have a scout. Nothing too exceptional there. And then at tier 1, we have the peasant pikeman, 60 draft and 50 gold. And the archer at a slightly more expensive 80 draft and 60 gold. And you can see between the 2 of them both dealing around 10 damage, and of course benefiting from that stand together as well, important to note. We then at tier 2 have the Bannerman, which has a 12 gold upkeep and is a bit stronger, a bit more expensive across the board. This will be our supporting unit, and of course dealing a bit of range damage here too. A lot of nice abilities across the board with the Bannerman. And likewise we have the Defender, which is sort of course, just an upgraded melee unit from the start. Not a huge change, except for its heavy shield and shielded defense. And last but not least, we have a mounted unit. It is our Feudal Knight. A nice 24 damage charging strike as well as standing together. It's a reasonably well-rounded unit and rounds off the feudal culture units, specifically of course at tier 3. Feudal societies specialize on battle formations and governance, and we can see that play out in their specific research as well. Obviously the signet of knighthood allowing non-feudal units to stand together, increasing their damage dealt when they stand near each other. This is very strong, of course, and it's a familiar formula of applying the race's ability onto non-feudal units. Pretty powerful, you'll want that, of course. The other ones give us a 1 hex radius buff for Steadfast, which is nice to have, though not as good as that Signet of Knighthood, important to note. And we also get Call to Glory, which gives 1 strengthened and 5 morale. So a couple of buff spells around the edge of that really important spell, which gives Stand Together, our feudal thing, to all of our units. Outside of that, of course, we have a unique improvement, the Levy Camp, which is all about farms, as you would expect, providing +5 food from farm adjacencies. And then we have a series of traits. Feudal Ruler, of course, followed by Underlying Loyalty, which is our hero's support skill. And lastly, that Stand Together, that novice hero skill. Unit deal +20% damage when adjacent to other friendlies. It's all about bringing units together, and this research does a good job at supporting that. The feudal ones are quite interesting. They replace the shrine and the mana obelisk here on our beautiful Age of Wonders 4 database resource, again linked below. You can see that we lose a little bit of mana income, which I suppose makes sense for what the feudal society is about, and instead gain some gold. So we're turning 5 mana into 5 gold, and then again 5 mana into 5 gold at tier 1 and tier 2 of this upgrade slot. I think that does make sense, although mana is potentially a slightly more difficult resource to earn. We may not want it as much as a feudal society. And then we have the Lord's Manor, which is our unique feudal structure. Doesn't replace anything, of course. It's just here once we get the city to tier 3 and build, in this case, the Town Hall 3 Citadel. The Lord's Manor provides plus 100% income from our governors, so we're getting an extra 15 knowledge, an extra 25 food on top of that 15 or 25 we were already getting, which is very nice, a nice internal synergy. We'll also get plus 10 gold and plus 10 food, two resources that are nice to have out of this upgrade. And now it's time to give rankings, thinking about the affinity potential that's on offer by these cultures. Although, of course, acknowledging that they only provide 2 affinity each, which is really the equivalent to 1 tome of magic. So I can't weight that too heavily, but it does need to factor in, particularly because it matters at the start. Then we also have, of course, the unique units and combat traits that the cultures offer, as well as their structures. How many of them are there, and what kind of yields or trade-offs are they giving me? Alongside of those province improvements and that kind of thing. Feudal, I think, is a very interesting and potentially incredibly powerful culture. It provides us with a unique mixture of 2 affinities, the nature affinity being very strong. I think that stand together is very useful, especially because the AI loves to stand together in auto combat. You're likely doing it your own. You can make use of it very easily and very readily. I think that the feudal culture therefore provides great affinities, and its buildings provide great yield too, with a strong focus on growth, particularly early on. Its unique governors mechanic provides an even stronger way for heroes to impact cities, and they do a good job at that, providing the yield of roughly 1 or 2 buildings each. I think the feudal culture is well balanced, well put together, and well deserving of a solid A-tier ranking. The second culture type on our list is the high culture. The high culture specializes in the order affinity, giving us 2 out of 2 possible affinities in the order slot. Of course, the only other one that gives us 1 being feudal. When we mouse over it, we see that the game tells us that high cultures are all about city stability and knowledge income, knowledge being a slightly rarer resource, city stability too, you could argue, than many others, and perhaps slightly more useful. Units are strengthened with Awakened, which reveals any hidden potential. We also receive a little bit of good alignment and the alignment agenda. So what does this stuff mean, and what are our unique unlocks? Well, firstly, we need to know that Awakened gives plus 4 spirit damage on base attacks. Good alignment, of course, perhaps even slightly harder to find than negative alignment, has some value in of itself. And then we have the alignment agenda, which leans into that positive alignment that we get from the start. In this case, if we're neutral, we'll receive 10 food and 10 production per city stability level above neutral. And if we can get to pure good, a plus 25 stability bonus on all cities. In evil, our units start combat in that awakened state. So there are different buffs depending on our alignment, but overall focusing on stability and knowledge. Let's now take a look at what they do specifically. We, of course, start with a scout, like any good culture would. In this case, of course, a little bit of extra vision range. Then we move through into our tier 1 units. We have the Dawn Defender and the Dusk Hunter. The Dusk Hunter being a little bit cheaper than some of the other archers in class, obviously in comparison to the feudal one we were just looking at, and weaker too. Both of these units fairly weak, fairly cheap. As you move through into tier 2, you'll unlock your priest, in this case the Sun Priest, of course, carrying through that awaken ability and dealing 16 spirit damage. By default, not too bad. Then we have the Daylight Spear, a somewhat weaker tier 2 unit in terms of its physical strike. Of course, we'll be trying to stack extra damages on top here. Not a terrible spearman, not the best in class. And last but not least, we have the tier 3 unit. In this case, it's the Awakener, and it really leans in to some of that extra damage, some of that extra spirit damage. In this case, actually dealing a little bit more, has a little bit more variety, slightly more damage than some of the other units in class. The Awakener is probably the strongest unit of the lot, even when you factor into account the different tiers and costs that are available. It's a reasonable unit inside of the high culture. In terms of research and upgrades, the high culture focuses on buffing allies and on diplomacy as well. And you can see the buffing allies come through with their research. All of them are either enchantments or buff spells. In terms of buff spells, we have Awaken Inner Radiance. Friendly units become awakened for 3 turns. And a nice healing spell that heals 20 temporary hit points and gives a unit 2 bolstered resistance. Really nice to get healing spells online early in the game, and of course Warding Blessing enables us to do that. It's quite cheap. And then lastly, the tier 3 enchantment in this case is Dormant Enchantment. It grants non-high units, so those units that don't get our default bonuses, Dormant. Guardian if a polearm unit, Dormant, Shield of Light if a shield unit, and Dormant Seeking Missiles if a ranged unit. The Awaken ability and Dormant are available. So again, what this is doing is bringing our abilities that would be culture specific and adding them to many of the rest of our units. Our initial bonuses in this case focus in on knowledge, which is quite nice. The Sunshine itself providing knowledge per adjacent research post, as well as just by default. And then, of course, we have our skills, our focused skills. The hero skill is Coordinated Strike, while Army Leader, Battle Mage, Ranged, and Skirmishers units in the army inflict physical, ranged, and magic damage. Then we have Exposing Light, which is a hero skill, dealing damage in and around a radius and sundering defenses, and Twin Awaken. Target a friendly unit and another non-awakened unit, and they both become awakened. So, of course, it's leading into that. There's perhaps not quite the strength and synergy of just universally applying it like there may be with others, but there's still enough here that you can get good value. For our buildings, we're replacing the Tier 1 workshop and then stonemason, or actually blacksmith building in the case of Tier 2, with something a little bit different. So the workshop traditionally provides 10 production and 10 draft. In this case, it provides 10 production, 5 draft, and we've swapped 5 draft for 5 stability income. The same, of course, is also true as you move through to the Light Forge, where we're swapping resources, but in this case, we're swapping 5 draft for 5 gold. An interesting swap on both of them. Getting stability early on out of the Artisan Workshop is a very early way to grab stability, although it is only 5. Important to note, that's a pretty good trade-off in Tier 1. In Tier 2, trading off 5 draft for 5 gold is somewhat insignificant, in my opinion. Not massive, both fairly run-of-the-mill resources, especially as far as gold is concerned. Don't get me wrong, people have often confused when I say that with me calling it not useful. It's absolutely useful. Many different ways you can use it. Also many different ways you can earn it, and I'm not sure that this +5 swap out is especially strong. And then up at Town Hall number 3, we have a Solar Nexus, our unique structure that we can build as a high culture, in this case providing +5 stability per conduit and research post. You're likely to have fewer of these than some of the base game improvements, at least at the start, but 5 stability from every conduit and research post, very strong. This has good internal synergies with our stability focus. While I'd like to see more of a stability focus perhaps across some of our units, you can definitely pick it up through Tomes of Magic. You likely will do, and this is a very powerful way to earn stability. One of the strongest ways you can earn it in the game, actually, as far as city structures are concerned. To rank the high culture is a somewhat difficult task. Ranking all of these is so difficult because I'd like to reiterate and stress the fact that they're all very close together in terms of power. The difference between an A and a B is very small on this tier list, whereas in a normal one, that power gap could be quite large. The high culture provides us with 2 order affinity, not the only way to get order, but the only way to get 2. It does, however, provide us with the only way to pick up an early positive alignment as we move through the culture selection anyway. Of course, there'll be other ways to grab that I've discussed in other tier list videos. But it's important to note that it's one of the only ways to get that. We also get that fairly nice ability to adjust our alignment and get different benefits off being really good or really bad out of order as well. I think that the high culture, leaning in with order, isn't especially strong in most of the things that it does, however. It providing us with a unique opportunity to get good alignment is one of the only things that I think it sets it apart from the rest. Its units are decent, but nothing exceptional. Its upgrades and the yields that it offers are perhaps a little bit weaker than most. But with a strong focus on stability and knowledge, one of perhaps the rarer and slightly harder to earn resources, and its rare positive alignment, I will be giving it an A tier, thanks to those strengths that just lift it up out of what could have very easily been a lower rank. Third on our list, we have Barbarian. Barbarian is the only way to get Chaos Affinity at the start out of your race. Of course, there are other things that you'll be customizing to pull these affinities in, but I can't make judgment calls on what you're going to pick there, only here. And when I'm looking here, this is very significant. The only way for us to get a chaos. We also get nature, where it's one of two cultures that provide it, of course, the other one being feudal. What do we do with this magic? Well, structures will gain food and draft. So there's a focus on war, on aggression, on charging head-on into battle. Melee units will have Primal Strike, dealing extra damage on the first strike in combat. The first melee strike to hit deals 8 blight damage, quite a bit of extra damage. And then we have the Ritual of Alacrity. Alacrity? No, I'm pretty sure I've nailed that. Players can activate the ritual on any owned outpost or city, and when it's activated, friendly units at the center restore 50% of their hit points, all of their movement points, and they're no longer exhausted from forced march. So you can kind of hold this ritual to restore a whole load of hit points and move your armies again. A real rallying call goes along with their primal strike thing. And now we have an understanding of what they look like at a base level. Let's see the detail. Starting off with our scout, nothing too crazy to see here except for the fact that apparently it has outpost builder, the unit's capable of creating outposts on the map. Go you. Moving along, our tier 1 and 2 fighters, we have some fairly powerful units. The Sundera dealing an impressive amount of damage with both a javelin throw and a melee strike. It's got a lot on offer. We also have a warrior, which is more of a traditional unit, at least in comparison to some of the rest. In terms of its damage and costs, the Sundera are a fantastic unit in its place in terms of its damage and its upgrades. Moving into tier 2, we have a war shaman, a slightly more aggressive shaman unit, only dealing 14 damage. It fits in reasonably well in class, has some resistances, and of course it's just generally fairly useful to have support units at this stage. The other tier 2 unit is Fury. Much worse, really, than the Sundera in most cases. If we have a look at comparing the two, there really is no comparison. Our Sundera is by far and away our best unit there until potentially we get to the Berserker, which has a heavy charge strike and a defensive mode for the best of both worlds. Of course, it has some nice upgrades as well. It's really the Sundera and to a lesser extent, the War Shaman and the Berserker that are carrying us through here. The rest of the units are fairly standard. In terms of our unique culture tome kind of stuff, we have Song of the Reckless, which gives units Berserk and 3 Strengthened, a similar format for buff spells that we'll see across the cultures. We have Vision of Victory, another buff spell, friendly units in 1 hex radius gain 3 Fortune, and then finally we have our version of applying our benefit to other units. It's Primal Mark. Primal Strike, which increases damage dealt by the first attack, is granted to your non-barbarian units, across, of course, a wide range of movement types. This kind of structure is fairly familiar at this point. In terms of our special effects, we have Forest of Stakes, which provides actually a really nice swathe of resources, food, production, and draft. Enemy units on the province also get demoralized, and it counts as a forester. As far as production goes, it's nice to see 3 different resources feeding into something that's somewhat unusual. Then, of course, we have Primal Mark, our hero skill. The first melee strike deals extra damage. Keen Edge, which gives us a little bit of extra critical hit chance on our hero. And lastly, our hero gains 10 temporary hit points and 1 strengthened thanks to its Bloodlust. Some nice synergies that round out a slightly weaker part of the culture, but still a very strong culture overall. The barbarian culture selects us or provides us with an opportunity to lose a bit of knowledge. It replaces the Tier 1 library and Tier 2 arcane institute with its own buildings. The battle ritual site swaps 5 draft, or 5 knowledge for 10 draft, I should say. So yeah, we're losing 5 knowledge. Not great. In exchange, we're gaining 10 draft. At the second tier, you'll see we go from getting 15 knowledge to getting 10 knowledge and 10 draft. So again, swapping out 5 knowledge in exchange for 10 draft. Knowledge is a rarer resource. In terms of effect, they're obviously 2 very different things. You're not often going to be swapping one of these for the other, so it's a rare effect. Not great to lose knowledge in the early game, so you better be making up for it with that draft. You better be training your units, which perhaps as barbarians, you may well be. Our unique shrine at Tier 3 feeds into this as well, that unit training, by granting War God's spirit to every friendly unit inside the domain, and War God's aggression to every unit produced in the city in future. You could specialize and focus down on this one a little bit. It's one of the slightly cheaper or perhaps middle-of-the-road shrines in terms of cost, in both gold and production, and it has a nice ability that will carry you through, so long as you keep focusing in, of course, on training up your units. To rank Barbarian is a pretty interesting one. Its affinities are probably the best on offer, due to the fact that it's currently the only way to get a Chaos affinity out of the culture customization section of the faction builder anyway. And we can only get one, so of course we're relying on Tomes of Magic, etc. moving forward to pick up those things, as well as our own traits. That makes it quite distinct. It's also benefited by the fact that the second one that you get, which is 1 nature affinity, is also a very good affinity tree. In terms of units, the barbarian culture has some of the best across the board, as you might expect, being that they are barbarians and they are warlike. I think their units really benefit from that. We see some of the strongest, some of the heaviest hitting units, and of course it leans in really well with their unique trait, which is all about hitting back, slamming out with some blight damage. A very strong combination across the board. Perhaps the only place where it is slightly let down is the yield that you're producing out of the units. Of course, here we favor draft over other things. Maybe not quite as strong as something like knowledge. However, you can't look past the internal synergy of having that draft. And as you move through and lean into chaos and or nature, you're going to have a really good time with the barbarian culture. As I've said earlier, the difference between these bands is very slim. I think all of the cultures are actually pretty good. But because Barbarian brings some chaos to the table, it brings fantastic synergies and the strongest units, some of the only things I can rank these cultures on apart from one another, I'm giving Barbarian an S tier ranking. Next, we have the Industrious culture. This is the culture that gives us Materium. It's the only culture, and it gives us 2 Materium. It focuses on production, mainly, as far as it goes in terms of income. Its special trait or affinity in this case is bolstering, which gives bolstered defense when hit by melee or physical ranged attacks, and gives resistance when hit by magic. So overall, a slightly defensive culture. It also receives scout prospecting. Industrious scout units stand within a friendly or neutral province that contains a cliff, mountain, or stalagmite. The player that owns the scout can prospect the province for production or gold rewards. So keep that in mind. There's a little bit of extra prospecting going on here for some sweet cash money or rewards early on if you are industrious. A quick look at the units. Here we have their scout, which does deal a bit more damage than most of the other scouts. It's important to note, perhaps riding along on that boar did them wonders. Then in terms of our tier 1 units, we have the Anvil Guard, which is a slightly more defensive version of the warrior, more defensive buffs, shield wall, etc. Slightly different way to play that. There's also the Arbalist, which deals an incredible amount of damage. Potentially with its overdraw crossbow, though there are some slight restrictions around how you can use it. It's a damage powerhouse in comparison to other units in class. At tier 2 we have the Steel Sharper, which is of course a polearm unit, 16 damage with all of those defensive wardings. Then we have, you guessed it, Another bad boy, this time not a support unit, I should say, but instead our dedicated polearm with only 12 damage as a melee strike. It's kind of weak, so you want to be relying on your defenses and your traits. And last but not least, at tier 3, we have the Bastion. Again, fairly weak in terms of the damage that it outputs at just 12 damage for its melee strike, so you'll want to be adding more and chanting, etc., etc. But, of course, you have some of the best defense and resistances in class. By this point, we're fairly accustomed with how the research works for these cultures, so I won't spend too much time on it, other than to say that I think there's a pretty good balance here, actually. The Rune of Industry is, of course, our tier 3 enchantment spell that will give bolstering to all of our non-cultured, non-industrious units. Then we have a buff spell at tier 1, which I think, as I mentioned earlier, is brilliant. Extra defense, 20 hit points, very early on, very cheap. And then we have a chant, which gives, for each stack lost, all friendly units, by the way, lose all stacks of bolstered defense and bolstered resistance. They gain strength and fortune. So it's an opportunity to turn the resistance that you've got, the defense that you've got, and flip it into the alternative one, strength and fortune, to push the aggressive instead of the defensive. As far as our bonuses go, we have Builder's Quarters, which is very similar to the other ones in terms of the yielded outputs, but in this case for production, which is nice to see. And then, of course, we have a series of hero expert skills. Always end your turn in defense mode, while army leader units in the army gain extra defense, and support abilities grant more defense. All about the defense, which we could swap to offense if we choose using this spell. In terms of our buildings, we're looking at the tier 1 and 2 food buildings, the storehouse and granary. And in this case, we're swapping out 5 food for an additional 5 production. As you might expect, the storehouse goes from 10 food, for example, to 5 food and 5 production. Granary from 20 to 15 and 5. Fairly standard effects, losing a little bit of food for growth, but getting some production to build things faster. Not a terrible outcome by any stretch. And as we move down the line, we'll take a look at Bastion's Barricade. Bastion's Barricade provides quite an interesting one in comparison to the others. It gives us 2 Bastions on the defender's side when fighting inside of this city, which will give plus 20 fortification health and also plus 10 city stability income. So nice across the board, a defensive building for our industriists, providing both fortification and some extra stability. I'd also note it's the cheapest one out of the lot that you can build, and perhaps rightly so. Next, we move to the industrial lots ranking, and this is a fairly interesting one. So they're focused on defense. Their buildings focus on production, not the best yield, but also not the worst, in my opinion. Fairly decent, of course, for building things, providing we have the gold to back it up, and we should do as industrious. The affinity materium, perhaps on the weaker side. Some of the least useful tomes and spells moving forward are likely to be in the materium class. As I learned and discovered in my full tier list of the tomes, most of them are pretty good. There are some S tier tomes in all of the affinities, so don't get me wrong, industrious fans, but I think on balance, this is a less useful affinity, and that needs to be taken into account. The units here are, of course, the most defensive by far, though offensively the strength is very low, so you're looking to sort of tank and wall out the enemy here, as opposed to really striking them down, because you don't have a lot of that potential in their units. And the unique structures, as I say, are fairly decent in providing production, but not really a lot else. As I've mentioned already, the gaps between these rankings are very narrow. I'm going to rank these guys, the industrious among us, at a C tier. I just don't think there's quite enough uniqueness. There's not enough strength in the materium affinity, and the units, also lacking a little bit in strength, results in a C tier ranking here. Next, we have the Dark Culture, providing, of course, 2 Shadow affinity points. Inside of the Dark Culture, here we're looking at, as you might be able to gather, sort of in many ways the opposite of the light. In this case, cities can negate city stability income penalties, so we're not worried about earning it. Instead, we're just going to ignore it. Unique city structures will provide us with knowledge, with extra income coming from prisons and crypts, very on theme. We also have units specializing, in this case, in inflicting negative status effects and exploiting enemies with Cull the Weak, which gives you extra damage when units are weakened, and attacking units with weakened grants you regeneration. And in this case, we receive a negative alignment, whereas of course with the high culture, we were receiving a positive one. We have a fairly standard scout here, the Outrider, though it can infiltrate enemy domain to get a little bit of extra vision across there, a nice little benefit. At tier 1, we have the Pursuer, a very standard ranged unit, very vanilla, very run-of-the-mill. We also have the Dark Warrior, which, while having Cull the Weak and a slightly stronger charge strike, is a fairly standard warrior. Moving through to a more magical unit, we have the Warlock. The Warlock deals an impressive amount of damage with its Sundering Curse, but otherwise comes in fairly standard. We also have the Night Guard, our polearm unit, which is actually somewhat weak. I mean, its resistances are alright, its traits are pretty good, but its sheer strength is nothing to write home about. And then last but not least, we have probably my favorite unit in the class. It's the Dark Knight. The Dark Knight has a heavy charge melee attack, as well as a Dark Surge spell. Both of them deal pretty good damage. It's got good movement, good resistance, and good health. In case you can't tell already, I'm a pretty big fan of the Dark Knight. I think it's a solid unit. And here we have a very familiar approach to research, a tier 3 enchantment that gives that Cull the Weak, increasing damage dealt to enemies with negative status effects, to all of our non-dark units, very important. And then we have 2 spells that are debuff or debuff damage. The damage one, Ice Shackles, can deal 14 frost damage and slow a target, while the debuff spell gives enemy units within a small 1 hex radius sundered defense, resistance, and weakened, adding in a little bit to that Cull the Weak thing, of course. Strong internal synergies here, easy spells, easy to cast, easy dubs. In terms of the initial bonuses, we're looking at the Dark Forge as our special tile territory improvement. In this case, giving us draft and gold with an adjacency bonus around quarries or mines for more draft. It's a unit deploy location as well, which could have some strength. Overall, it's perhaps not the strongest improvement, but still a very decent one. Don't get me wrong, they're all very on theme. And then, of course, as our promotions, we have Cull the Weak, Grim Executioner, which can give you some fortune, and then Sundering Curse, which adds into weakening the enemies. Nice hero skills, very on theme. Nicely done. We're spoiled for choice with our special buildings. We have a few more than normal, actually. Here, firstly, we replace the traditional vendor and markets, which are about gold earning, with some nice buildings that add knowledge. One of the only ways to add extra knowledge early on outside of getting the library, the Arcane Institute, etc. Swapping 5 gold for 5 knowledge in both of these buildings is a very good thing. I think this is very strong. Easy trade. I'd happily trade 5 gold for 5 knowledge, or 1 gold for 1 knowledge if I could have that trade rolling. Nice buildings. As we move across the tree, you'll notice that the stability buildings that come out of Town Hall 2, the Tavern and Bathhouse, have been replaced. Let's have a look at the Tavern, which would normally provide plus 20 stability income. Now it becomes an interrogation dungeon, giving us minus 5 stability income. In exchange, 10 base knowledge and plus 2 knowledge income per hero in the prison. The Bathhouse replacement does a very similar thing. Goodbye positive stability, hello minus 5, but now it gives us mana. Plus 10 mana and plus 2 per hero in the crypt. These are really nice ways to get mana and knowledge, difficult resources to get. Yes, you're swapping stability. However, within this culture, we don't really care so much about the negative stability impacts. In fact, they won't really impact us at all as we move through, especially. And speaking of as we move through, the Overlord's Tower at Tier 3 prevents provinces breaking off due to low stability. So there's one of the huge downsides, gone altogether. We also get plus 10 draft income and plus 10 mana income. Placing Dark on the tier list is quite a difficult call, but the culture does a lot. Of course, it sort of mirrors the high culture in providing some negative, some bad alignment instead of good. Arguably slightly easier to get the bad alignment and a slightly worse alignment to have. But that is, of course, down to personal preference and playstyle. If you're playing on a map with a lot of negatively aligned enemies, you might not want to be the order high one strolling in. You might want to actually get along with everybody. So there's lots of nuances involved in that. But I thought it was important to note nonetheless. Our buildings and yield focus around research. As I've already mentioned, I think that's one of the stronger resources to focus on in terms of having more ways to produce it. And ultimately, it is our science tree, it is our unlock tree. So it's a fairly important one. The units themselves, not especially strong, though there are one or two really standout units and standout upgrades among its lot. You know how I feel, for example, about its tier 3 unit. And then the final thing to consider, I suppose, are the traits that build into the dark units, the enhancements, the skills, and the fact that it provides a unique souls-based economy, a unique yield for this culture that others don't have. While feudals may have their unique governors, here we have souls, and we can produce and burn and create units out of them. And I think that is also a unique selling point, and it might just be the selling point that pushes the dark culture alongside its focus on research, its fairly powerful units, and having more city structures than the rest pushes these slightly negatively aligned people right up to the top of my list, just edging out for an S tier ranking. And last but not least, a culture of scholars, let's take a look at Mystic. Mystic, of course, provides us with 2 affinity points into the Astral affinity, the only way to get it inside of this culture selection. Here we focus naturally on mana income. Units will also have a special attunement, in this case it's Star Blades, which makes them stronger when a spell is cast in battle. When a spell is cast, the unit's base attack randomly gains +1 fire damage, lightning damage, or frost damage for 3 turns, and it stacks up to 3 times. So you're probably casting a spell every turn, let's be real. If you're not, you're kind of doing something wrong. Let's assume you're casting 2 or 3. There's a sort of a constant +2 or +3 fire, lightning, or frost damage cumulatively across your units thanks to these blades. And you also have access to Astral Echoes, which are special pickups around the map that grant you knowledge and mana, and some units or buildings or what have you can leverage off that as well. In the same way that, while I didn't mention it earlier, dark cultures have souls as their special currency. All of the cultures, of course, have their own different themes. There's a lot going on to unpack. Let's unpack some of the detail for Mystic now then. Starting with their scout, which is fairly run-of-the-mill, except for it has a pretty weak but wide-ranging magical attack ability, providing 1 damage in a lot of different sectors. It also has pass-through, so you can move through obstacles, potentially making it slightly easier to scout. At tier 1, we have an Arcane Guard, a melee unit with a 12 damage melee strike, a little bit of resistance around it, some first strike, and of course that Star Blades attunement, so you'll be dealing a lot of damage across the board, across the different categories. Not very strong though. And again, you'll see that dealing the 3 different types, the lightning, the fire, and the frost, here with the other tier 1 unit, the Arcanist. At tier 2, we move through to our Soother, which looks fantastic, deals actually quite a nice amount of damage for probably the first time, and has some reasonable resistances to boot. We also have Spell Shield, which is like a shielded unit, but it can deal magical damage with its stunning flash. There's a nice little bit of variety inside of this unit, though its attacks aren't very strong. And then last but not least, the tier 3 unit in this case, Spellbreaker. Spellbreaker, of course, again following with that theme of dealing lots of different types of damage, as is typical of the culture. And dealing slightly less damage than most of the other units in class. This one is unique in how it deals damage. Its damage profile is very unique, but it is weaker, perhaps, than the rest of the tier 3 units. The Mystic research remains on theme, with a buff spell adding defense and resistance, a damage spell striking 10 damage across those 3 magical categories, lightning, fire, and frost. That's especially a powerful early damage spell. 30 damage is about the most that we can get, and splitting it across the 3 different magics is nice to see. And then, of course, we have our special scroll, our tier 3 scroll that adds Star Blades to our non-Mystic units. Very familiar structure. In terms of the initial bonus, we can get a little bit of extra mana and knowledge out of the Mystic Abbey, 2 resources that are nice to have. And then we have our hero skills, where we have Attuned Cast, Resistance Training, and of course those Star Blades. The Star Blades being the base one, the one that's most important. Attuned Cast adding 10 combat casting points this combat. Nice to have. Those abilities that give you combat casting points are slightly rarer than most. And now our last look at the city development tree. In this case, of course, we're looking for the Mystic building, and it's swapping out for our workshop and our stonemason. Like we swapped the workshop earlier, but in this case, we're losing some production, 5 of it, and getting 5 mana. We'll keep our draft income the same. And then with the stonemason, which would normally give 15 production, in this case it's only giving 10, again, 5 extra mana. And our special building, the Altar to the All-Seers, can only be built in the Throne City. Important to note, and it grants the All-Seers blessing to every unit produced in the city. So it's slightly less wide-reaching than some of the other ones, which have also impacted units in the territory, but still a strong buff, nice to have nonetheless, at one of the more expensive city upgrades. Ranking the Astral, the Mystic, among us is a little bit difficult because, of course, the playstyle may be very different. You may have, obviously, a lot higher mana upkeep, and therefore the production of mana out of your buildings is going to be very, very useful to you. Across the board, I tend to weight mana as a fairly middle-of-the-row use resource. It's useful, of course, for spells and upkeep. Quite important that we have it high, but we'll also need to be focusing on research and Imperium and food for growth as we balance it out. Now, looking at the culture specifically, the units are slightly underpowered, but of course they all focus in on that thing of dealing fire and frost, etc. damage, rather than focusing and really piercing the enemy. So I have to keep that in mind too. I think that their unique structures provide good yield and fair trade-offs of resource, and the unique units overall are perhaps, at the risk of reusing a phrase I love to use, nothing to write home about, i.e. they're good, they're not great. They're not standout. The affinity potential here is obviously fairly unique in that we're getting 2 of our resource, just like most of the others do. And the tree behind the astral affinity is a fairly decent one, though I can't factor that in too strongly to my considerations here. Overall, I think that the astral affinity is a pretty good one. It does what it should do. I think that the culture behaves as it should. I think it's a fairly middle-of-the-road one in terms of strength, with no specific standout, but it just does what it order. It does what it says on the box. There's no extra benefits aside from those astral resources that you will pick up, gaining you a little bit of extra knowledge and a little bit of extra mana as you move through. There's really nothing else to set it apart, and for those reasons and more, I'll be ranking it at a B tier. And that concludes my ranking of the cultures currently in Age of Wonders 4. Let me know what you think below. I'd like to again reiterate that there's very little distance between these rankings, between an S and an A, between an A and a B. They're all pretty close together, but I'm fairly happy with how I've landed on those. Maybe the only ones I'm staring at a little closely are the A's. I think the A's were the hardest ones for me to rank. Personally, outside of recording, I bounced around whether they should be ranked at S tier or A tier. You know, is a good alignment good enough to push you up because it's one of the only ways to get it? Well, potentially not, because there's plenty of other things at play. Let me know what you think and how you'd place them. Thankfully, it's pretty easy to share because there's only 6 of them, so you could even comment your order and slap it in the comments below. And until next time, everybody, I'll see you then for more Age of Wonders 4.